Welcome to Master of Science with host Professor James McCanney. The good professor's career spans 50 years as a university teacher, scientist, and engineer. Each week, he will explore the rapidly changing world of science as many long-held theories are crumbling under the weight of new data. He will cover the fields of geology, archaeology, meteorology, oceanography, space science, astronomy, cosmology, biological evolution, virology, energy, mathematics, and more. So please welcome the host of Master of Science, James McCanney.
And good evening again, everybody. James McCanney here. And tonight, this is starting a few episodes delving into a topic. We're going to do some deep dives into the topic of supposedly what's going on called climate change. There are many, many aspects to this. One of my books is called The Diamond Principle. And the center concept there is that a diamond has many facets and many cuts, many different ways of looking at it that give it its complete essence as a diamond. And this is a topic that has many, many facets to it. And we're going to take some deep dives into this. Also, if everything goes correctly, we'll have some guests in the next couple of weeks who will take some other deep dives into this. Some people who have been very active in calling out the corruption that is it has hooked its wagon to this entire issue of global warming. It's not all goody sunglasses with rose-colored glasses. No, it's an international. We'll talk about that. I'm going to talk about the history of where this came from, because there's a lot of this has been obfuscated. A lot of it is completely out of the picture now. Where did all of this come from? Where did it start? What is the science behind it? How did this funding engine get going with the federal government and international organizations like WHO and the United Nations and many other organizations that are, what is IPCC, on and on and on, where international organizations and the banking community that is funded out of the bank of the Vatican Bank, I call it, which has its front agency, the Rothschild World Banking Organization. And they have a way of controlling governments. In London, it's the Bank of London. In Rome, based in Rome, it's called the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund. In the United States, it's called the Federal Reserve. Interesting. Well, I'm not going to go into banking tonight, but all I'm saying is these various groups have taken over control, and one of the big control factors has been climate change. I'll talk about the Paris Peace Accord. What did it really say? And people think, oh, it's to save the world, to save the planet. No, If you read it, if you took time to actually read it, which 99.99% of the people have not, this gets into what we call emotional science. Emotional science is when a concept is pumped and driven just with mass, what I call blanket coverage media, to until the point where people they're afraid of it. It's called fear porn, literally, in the back of the newsroom, where you find they're selling fear. The fear that, if the temperature rises, the ice caps are going to melt and oceans are going to rise and all of the coastal cities will be inundated. They've been saying this making 5-year predictions since the 1950s. But it's never happened. They talk about, for example, Venice. Well, Venice is sinking. The oceans are not rising. Venice is sinking. But they like to play on that. Oh, look at water's coming in. It's going to ruin the city. I've been in Venice, and it's a strange experience. walking on a floating city, literally a city that's floating, that they put piers down into the water to hold up the buildings, and it's been that way for hundreds of years. It's a rather eerie feeling, and to my way of looking at it at any rate. I feel the safest when I'm in a boat there. Because if the whole thing just sank one day, if there were an earthquake or something, it's very susceptible. But anyway, I digress. Excuse me. So, where did all of this come from? And I want to start out by just saying something. When I was a kid, there were great glaciers out in Montana and Wyoming, and they covered huge areas, and slowly they melted away and they're gone. In my lifetime. So we have seen glaciers disappear. Now, is that due to global climate change? Is that due to your driving your Model T Ford up and down the road? Or burning coal for all the different uses coal has been used for? And the answer is no. The answer is no, because the Earth has the capability to release heat every night. There is so much bad science wrapped around this entire concept of global climate change that I just can't tell you. But the real situation is that we are literally coming out of an ice age. And the dating on this now, here's another recent wave of misinformation, trying to push the ice age back 12,000 years. No, it was within the last probably about 4,500 years when the major ice, the glaciers formed. But here's the thing, we had a pole shift, literally a physical pole shift. Now today there's other, like I say, YouTube is filled with misinformation, which results from the fact that government-supported science like NASA, government-supported science like geology and universities, etc., their teachings revolve around bogus science. The greatest event in man's history in the last 5,000 years was a pole shift, where we literally, and this is caused by a large celestial body coming by, and what does it do? It sends a gravitational wave into the Earth. My book, it's a short pamphlet, it's called Surviving Planet X Passage, gives a diagram on how this process works. But at any rate, what we call the Laurentian ice cap was the source of our western state glaciers. Those were the remnants after the pole shift. And what happened is the old North Pole was in a region, what is now we call Hudson's Bay. And that's where the old North Pole was. That's where the old magnetic North Pole was. By the way, there are people running around jumping up and down on YouTube talking about magnetic pole shifts. Let me tell you right from the beginning, magnetic pole shifts happen frequently, maybe once a month, where the solar magnetic field comes in reversed, and it actually totally reverses Earth's magnetic field, which the majority of Earth's magnetic field is due to plasma. That is charged particles moving in belts around the Earth, including the Van Allen belts, including electrical currents in the ionosphere, and a little bit of contribution due to the magnetism in our Earth's crust and mantle. And that's because you're standing on Earth, that's what you measure when you have a compass in your hand. And by the way, your phone is not a magnetic compass. When your phone gives you north, it's because of GPS. It's because of those satellites up there. And I got a kick out of this one kid. He went over to some structures in the Mideast, and he had his phone there. And he said, look, they got it perfectly northeast, south, and west. Well, when those buildings were built, there was no cell phone service nor GPS. So those people had to use celestial reckoning to determine true north. So I think it's rather comical that sometimes the younger generation doesn't understand certain things, like the difference between a cell phone compass and a magnetic compass. Anyway, I'm not going to go down that road this morning. this evening, whatever time it is where you are. But okay, back to the pole shift. This is instrumental in understanding, and like I say, there's a big push on major public radio shows today to try and put the Ice Age 12,000 years ago. No, it was much more recent, and it was accompanied by a pole shift. Now, if you take a look at, pick up a globe or pick up a map of the world and understand that the Laurentian ice cap, this is the old North Pole ice cap, did not, I repeat, it did not go into what is now we call Siberia. It was, it included Greenland. In fact, the only part of the old North Pole which is still capped is Greenland. It was under the old cap, and it's under the new cap, the current ice cap. It's part of the North Polar Cap. And it is melting because it's farther away from the North Pole than it was during the old North Pole days. Okay, so critical to understanding what's going on today is understanding that we are coming out of an ice age. We had an ice age that occurred, and then what happened is those glaciers melted. They gave us the Great Lakes. They gave us the lakes of Wisconsin, Minnesota, Canada. Canada was completely covered, just about wall to wall covered with glaciation. And like I say, Siberia was more of a temperate climate, and that is why you will find mastodons, woolly mammoths, frozen in the tundra of Siberia. And the woolly mammoths were a temperate climate animal. They were, you know, like 5-8 times the size of an elephant, a current day elephant. And they were flash frozen, found with the food still undigested in their throats. That's how fast they were flash frozen. And so what does it take to do that? And I want to concentrate on this because this is so instrumental in understanding where we are today. I'll quick preface this by saying what we are doing now in terms of climate on Earth is we are coming out of an ice age. And those glaciers, the western glaciers, when they were white, reflected sunlight and it maintained them. But eventually where the Earth is getting back to normal. We are getting back to normal, what the Earth was like before this pole shift. There was the old South Pole, which was near an island in the South Indian Ocean called McDonald's Island. You can find it on even a large, medium-sized globe will have McDonald's Island. So take your fingers, take the globe out of its rack, do this little exercise, and it'll inform you where the old North Poles were. And remember, this is not a magnetic pole shift. This is a physical pole shift caused by a large astronomical body in the form of a comet. Then this would be the planetary nucleus of a comet. And yes, comets are not dirty snowballs. They're the discharge of the solar capacitor. Take a look at this poster, and I suggest you read my books and understand these concepts. I'm not going to repeat all of that here. This is a summary, but let's go back to the pole shift and the mastodons. The mastodons were flash frozen. They were found standing on their feet. They didn't even have time to die and fall over. And so they had a radical change, and the Earth's crust shifted by about 25 to 30 degrees. And this is variable because the Earth's crust moved differently. But essentially, there's a large gravitational body moving quickly by the Earth within close range sends a gravitational wave into the surface of the Earth, shifts it over the core, and then regains the angular momentum because the core didn't shift. The core kept spinning at approximately the same rotation. And what we find is that the calendars changed all over the world about 4,500 years ago from a 360-day year to a 365-day year. I sell, by the way, a product that I invented. It's called the Recalendar Sunstar Clock. It's on my webpage. And it's designed so that you can understand the stars and the sun clock and calendar that we currently have, and that if there were a pole shift, you could adjust this device and figure out the new calendar. And so I'm going to talk more about that at another time. It's going to take probably an entire show to talk about that item. You can go and see it on my webpage here, the jmccsci.com webpage. Look under the educational materials and the products that are physical products. That's what you look for. Okay, so sometime I'll talk more about that. That's a great educational tool for students because it gives them an understanding of our solar system, of the sun, of the calendar, where does it come from, both from the stars and from the sun calendar and the clocks. How does the sun time work? How does star time work? And what happens when you have a pole shift? How does all that change? In fact, our orbit changes, the spin axis rotational period of the Earth changes. All of these things change. And by the way, that device, interestingly enough, when I designed it, I put a lot of information on there that would allow some archaeologist in the future, say 5,000, 10,000 years from now, say we have a pole shift, a physical pole shift, and the Earth's pole shift changes again, and all of our orbital parameters and the spin axis periodicity of the Earth changes. They would be able to tell what our current orbit is and associate it with our calendar, something that is not available when we go to archaeological sites. That's one of the big problems with archaeological sites is we find this mess. It's all covered up, typically, and disarray, a lot of things broken. But there's no calendar. There's no way for us to understand what the solar system conditions were like when that city was thriving. And so anyway, my Recalendar Sun-Star Clock gives the information of our orbit right now and the precession, everything related to our orbit, so that people in the future could come back and say, aha, here's where their orbit was, here was their calendar, here was the daily, the measurements, etc. So anyway, very interesting device, a lot of thought going into that, called the Recalendar Sun-Star Clock. Okay, so anyway, back to the pole shift that occurred about 4,500 years ago. And you might be asking, well, what was this object that came by and did all this damage to Earth? And by the way, the Mayans talk about it, and this is what Immanuel Velikovsky was all about, one of the greatest scholars of the 20th century. And he was poo-pooed, he was degraded, he was basically put to shame. He was called the crazy old man, pseudoscience, and he was not studying astronomy, he was not studying comets, he was studying calendars. One of the most intelligent people and a good friend with Albert Einstein. In the 1980s, I was publishing some of my work in a journal, and its editor was a man named Werner Sizemore. Werner Sizemore was Velikovsky's personal secretary. So I got to know Werner very well, and I interviewed him. I knew he was getting older, and I knew he wasn't going to last forever. So I had some interviews where I put that on. In fact, they're available on my webpage, those interviews, on a CD form. But anyway, I interviewed Werner Sizemore, and he filled me in on the life of Immanuel Velikovsky, he was resident at Princeton University, and he was good friends with Albert Einstein. And so anyway, a lot of people today say that, oh no, Einstein and Velikovsky never were friends. Yes, they were. They were very good friends. In fact, they were together all the time. Einstein would come over to Velikovsky's house and have supper with him and play the violin. Einstein was a violinist, and he would play the violin, and then they'd eat supper. And Werner was there all the time. He was literally, he recorded all of Velikovsky's talks. He was there to as a secretary. He was simply taking records and notes. And Warner passed away a number of years ago. But what Velikovsky was studying was calendars. And what he realized in studying languages, ancient languages from around the world, this is in the 1930s and 40s, that all of the ancient cultures, they talked about a couple different things. One of them was the Great Flood. But what he was looking for was something that occurred where you could take the timelines of, for example, ancient Egypt and the pharaohs, and the incident of Moses coming out of Egypt with the Israelites, and trying to, and you have the Chinese, and you have people in different parts of the world who are literally recording this same event with Venus. And they're talking about Venus coming through the solar system, that it removed the atmosphere and oceans on Mars, and that's why Mars looks the way it does today. And geologists agree. I've been in American Geophysical Union meetings where the geologists are talking about Mars, the rovers and the evidence, and they say all of this water erosion on Mars is recent, like hundreds, thousands of years recent, not millions, not billions of years recent. And there's all kinds of evidence. But anyway, the story is that Velikovsky discovered was that Venus came by Mars and came close to it and relieved it of its atmosphere and oceans. And so, in fact, when you see the beginning of the lead into this show, if you're watching the television version, you can see my logo, very beautiful round logo there. And off of the nucleus of the comet is coming like a snake-like structure, which is an electrical discharge, with and its jaws are surrounding a planet. It looks like something like this with the planet in the middle. And that's what the ancients talk about when they saw Venus come by Mars. It took and it lifted. Mars was a blue planet. Now it's a red hulk of a planet with no water. Maybe a little trace near the South Pole, maybe. But Velikovsky discovered this, and he also discovered that Venus came by Earth. And this is corroborated by the Mayans, talking about Quetzalcoatl, the plumed serpent god of the night sky, whose heart became the planet Venus. This is in the Mayan Popol Vuh. The Incas talk about the same thing. The Aztecs adopted it, kind of like the Romans adopted the Greek pantheon of gods. The Aztecs adopted the Mayan pantheon of gods, and the discussion of Venus, and Venus the comet, the large comet that came through the solar system. And then you might ask, well, where do I come in with all of this? When I was at Cornell, by the way, I never knew about Velikovsky. I had been out of the country and teaching in a university, and when I came back, I got the job at Cornell. Teaching in the physics department, and I never had heard about Velikovsky. And I did not know that there was this big hullabaloo between Carl Sagan and Velikovsky. And of course, Carl Sagan was the David Duncan Chair of Astronomy at Cornell. And so here I come along, just not really understanding what was going on there. And I'm using NASA's data to show that comets are not dirty snowballs, that they're the plasma discharge, the discharge of the solar capacitor, that the solar systems are electrical, all of these things that they denied relative to Velikovsky. And I'm finding it in the data when they're going out to Jupiter and Saturn and Venus, and I'm publishing in peer-reviewed journals. So they went crazy. Anyway, that's another story. But what they did, what Sagan and the boys did, is they muddied up Velikovsky's name so that nobody would dare mention it again, because they would lose their career, their funding, their ability to publish. That's called blackballing. In other words, don't cross this line, don't talk about this subject. And that's in place today. So you'll find people today, oh, Velikovsky has been long since proven incorrect. No. He was very correct. He was very correct in everything he did. Actually, he made some mistakes, some major mistakes. And by the way, if you want to hear an interesting debate, This was, I don't have the exact date, it's probably about 20 years ago now. I was invited on Coast to Coast AM. George Norrie called me up one night and he said, James, you want to be on a debate? And they wanted me to debate Dr. David Morrison, who is Carl Sagan's prize student, and who was then in charge of the near-Earth asteroid search mission of part of NASA. So anyway, high-level NASA resident scientist, Dr. David Morrison, and wanted me to debate him relative to my work. Like I say, this is probably a good 20 years ago. So I said, okay, I'll do that, but with some basic ground rules. And so anyway, I ended up talking to David Morrison a number of times before the debate, and they had it scheduled, and it was a big event. It was one of the most listened to Coast shows probably in history. And the debate ensued, and I won it with a call-in vote. The vote, in spite of all of the press and all of the effort and all of the, the name NASA and all of the high-ranking executive scientists at NASA, opposed to Velikovsky, and what I was talking about was my own work, the electrical nature of the solar system and everything. I thought going into that I would lose 100-0 because I knew there would be like a call-in vote. I actually won it with a call-in vote, and which meant that the public believed me, not NASA. And this is really a problem because that still exists today, and the problem is that it opens the door for, like I said last week, I talked about this, it opens the door for every quack and wannabe and Johnny-come-lately to jump onto YouTube and have a YouTube page and have just bogus concepts rolling around YouTube, everything under the sun. And that's the reason is because the public doesn't trust NASA. It's as simple as that. If there was trust in NASA, none of that would exist. But anyway, this is a complicated story, but it all comes back to the history of climate change. This is all fundamental in understanding climate change and where all of this came from. Okay, so at any rate, the Earth is coming out of an ice age, and it was a cooling period because what happened is when the Earth had a pole shift, of course the North Pole and the South Pole shifted, Antarctica all of a sudden became covered with ice. Antarctica, what we call Antarctica now, was a temperate climate continent used by the Atlanteans, and remember the Phoenician mariners had maps that Columbus had, the Piri Reis map, which was a composite of ancient maps, a lot of them coming from the Phoenicians, and who had been worldwide seafarers and traders. And they used to go through what is now the North Pole, which we might call the Northwest Passage. Remember that the North Pole is floating ice. It's not, there's no hard land under the North Pole like there is in Antarctica where you have a landmass. But at any rate, the Piri Reis map that Columbus had showed the coastline that we now know corresponds to Antarctica. But wait a minute, Antarctica was covered with ice in the days of Columbus. And it turns out that Antarctica was a trading location for the Phoenicians back in the days of Atlantis, which may have been maybe 8,000 years ago. We don't know. We don't know a time frame. I talk about Atlantis, where the Pillars of Hercules were the volcanoes Krakatoa and the sister volcano on both sides of the Strait of Sunda between Sumatra and Java, and that entered into what we now call the South China Sea, where Atlantis was. That was the major five-ringed city. I talk about this in my book, Atlantis to Tesla, The Colburn Connection. Okay, so anyway, what I'm telling you is that everything you understand about history is completely wrong. Completely wrong. In the standard science that comes out of the lofty universities like Cornell or the West Coast universities is completely wrong. And that's why more and more people are listening to this show, because they know something's wrong, but they don't know what, and you're not going to get it on the evening news, Yeah, for sure. They don't they don't cover that. This is the only place you're going to get a real solid story. Okay, so at any rate, there was a pole shift. When the pole shifted to its current location, the magnetic North Pole, which was concurrent with the old North Pole in Hudson's Bay, began migrating up to the current North Pole, and it's still doing that. So you see that every year the North Pole moves a little bit, it's creeping up towards the current North Pole. That's one of the remnants of this pole shift. But the Great Western Glaciers were remnants of the original North Polar Cap, what we call the Laurentian ice cap. Now go online, go pick up and its Laurentian ice cap, look at it where it was. It did not extend into Siberia, which tells us that the old North Pole was not where it currently is. And the Laurentian ice cap came down all the way into Iowa and all the way west to the state of Oregon. And it covered that whole area. And when it melted overnight. All that water washed out what are now known as the scablands of Oregon, or of Oregon. And there's this region where the water just washed through there. The Mississippi Valley is another one. I went to school in a little town in southeastern Minnesota. My college, St. Mary's College, is in Winona, and it's a river town. It's on the north. It's on the Mississippi River. But when the college itself is up on a bluff, so every day I could look out over the vast wash that probably 10 miles wide that washed out when that glacier melted very quickly and blew out all the way down through to New Orleans. And now what we see is the Mississippi River, which is just maybe a mile wide at that point, and this little channel down in the valley. Well, the whole area there washed out. And this is probably around 4,500 years ago when the pole shift occurred. And like I say, there are Johnny-come-latelys, people that don't have any clue of what they're talking about, trying to push this out to 11,000 years ago. No, this happened within recent history. And the other thing is there's a lot of secrecy going on in higher levels around the world. And I won't call it government because it's not government. These are secret societies, and that's one of the things I exposed in my book, Atlantis to Tesla, The Colburn Connection, were the secret societies. So in the control of information, and they are also embedded in the Vatican Bank, the Jesuit-owned bank that is housed in Rome, where the World Bank, the International Monetary, actually is the central point. Like I said, the Bank of London, the Federal Reserve in the United States are branches of this. Okay, so I'm not going to get into banking, but embedded into these banking organizations are secret societies. And one of the things, they own all of the companies in the world. They own the corporation that is the United States with gold, hundreds of them. All of that went to the Vatican, and that's where they got their power. So when the Queen of England sits on her throne, her power comes from the Vatican Bank. So you have to understand all of this to understand how we get to the nefarious situation we are today with control coming through the means of this thing called climate change. Okay, so I'm trying to give you some history so you can understand. So the Western glaciers melted in my lifetime. They were still there. They were pretty large when I was a little kid. But they melted and they went away. There was the Yellowstone had glaciers, the Montana had glaciers, Wyoming had glaciers, and they simply went away. Why? Because Earth is getting back to normal. We are coming out of an ice age. And so, yes, we are warming up. And so the bad science of climate change makes you feel guilty because you're driving your SUV up and down the road. And now people will be aghast. Well, we got to save the planet. Well, the end result is that we use far too much energy, period. That's another issue. So don't muck it up with climate change. That's a political football. The Paris Peace Accords, or the Paris Climate Peace Accords, is a way to tax the United States and move that money to China. China, India, those countries are not required to do anything. In fact, they're bringing online another coal plant every day in China to match the amount of electricity that they need in that country for development. They're not subject to anything in the Paris Climate Change Accord, nothing, nor India. But the United States, you can't do this, you can't whatever, and they want to tax you for breathing, and then telling you you're the problem. No, it's all about destroying the United States, and anybody who knows anything about the world and the governance of the world, if you want to call it that, knows that they have to take down the United States to equalize the control, the one world government of the world. And that's what their goal is, one world economic government. You have the people like Klaus Schwab, or the other laundry list of people. And then you have their minions, the Clintons, the Bushes, in political offices carrying out, they're the clogs in the wheel. They're the ones that get their earthly rewards for carrying out the agenda of the global elite, you might call them, or the central banking community. They're all one group. And for a long time, they controlled the United States. And much to their chagrin right now, much of this is being exposed. And so, anyway, this is a very complicated world we live in, but you have to understand it. And climate change is at the core center of this. Okay, so with that little bit of history in place, let me talk about the origin of climate change. Where did this come from? How did this get started? How did it get ingrained in everyday life? How did you get people like Greta Thunberg, who would come on, a young girl who flies around the world on her private jet, by the way, thank you very much, and trying to raise emotional science, I call emotional science, with kids. Let me give you another example of this happening in history. Go back to the Crusades. Remember the Crusades, the quest to take back the Holy Land for Christianity? And if you look at it, was all centered around Jerusalem. And that's still going on. But at any rate, the Western Christian Empire, you might want to call it, gathered the forces, and they did it by mustering up this sentiment: we have to go take the Holy Land back for Christianity, and it's controlled by those darn Muslims over there. And so, excuse me, this is the activity at the time, and so they go and they have repeated crusades, and there's even one. This is my point. There's even one called the Children's Crusade, where they convinced the kids in Europe that it was the kids' duty to march off to the Holy Land to take back the Holy Land for Christianity. And they do this through the same mind control techniques that they're using today with climate change. That's why I'm talking about this. You have to put all of this into perspective. Okay, so where did all of this get its roots? And the answer comes back to the 1970s with a guy named Carl Sagan. Like I say, when I was at Cornell, 79 to 81, I was in the physics and math department there. Probably one of the very few people, maybe the only person that ever worked in two departments there at the, the chairman of the mathematics department when I was there told me, he said, "James, do you know that you're the only person in the mathematics department who's ever published in peer-reviewed astrophysics journals?" And it never crossed my mind. but I was getting my papers based on my theoretical work published in astrophysics journals, peer-reviewed. And it did not go well, let's put it this way, with the hierarchy in the astronomy, astrophysics, and space science departments, because I was using their data to prove them incorrect and bring in an entirely new set of data. And as I said, I never knew the whole time I was there. I never knew about the Velikovsky issue or the Carl Sagan. Let's put it into perspective. In 1974, Carl Sagan, or let me back up a step here. Immanuel Velikovsky published his first book in 1950 with Macmillan. It was a textbook company, and it was selling madly around the world. It was the bestseller that they had. And of course, Macmillan was a textbook company. And so it was, he was basically taking the headlines around the world, that there was this ancient disaster and that caused the Earth to have drastic tidal waves and mountain building and all of the other things reported by the ancients. And all he was doing was interpreting ancient texts and writing it down and noting that the mastodons were flash frozen in the Siberian tundra to the point where the Siberian Railway, when it was being dug through the tundra, they were building the Trans-Siberian Railway, the Russians, and they were encountering these mastodons, flash frozen there for thousands of years. And the meat was so fresh that they could sell it. First of all, they were eating it to feed the workers on the railroad crews. And they got so much of it, they started shipping it off to France as a delicacy. Now, if there were even a few minutes, a big animal like that would start to decompose. In one day, it would be to the point where you certainly would not want to eat it. So it was flash frozen, and Velikovsky is pointing out all of these things. Okay, so at any rate, Velikovsky is very popular. His first book, Worlds in Collision, comes out in 1950. Then Ages in Chaos, Earth in Upheaval follow. And the people are going crazy over this. And so the astronomical community is like, no, this can't be true. There's this, we're not saying this, that could not possibly be true, that a comet came through the solar system. And back in the day, in the 60s and the early 70s, this is like during the Apollo program, for example, when NASA is reigning supreme and sending men to the moon, and they're starting to discover things in space. You know, the space scientists are starting to get active data coming back from outer space. And so the news media goes to these like people in the scientific community saying, well, you're saying Velikovsky's wrong. What is your story? Well, it turns out they didn't have one. They didn't have a composite story. They didn't know what comets were. There were concepts. For example, one of the concepts was that it was a loosely bound dust cloud. And as it came to near the sun, that dust cloud would stretch out, and when it went away from the sun, the dust cloud would pull together because of differential forces in gravity. They didn't know. They tried to take pictures when they had comets cross the surface of the sun. They tried to take pictures, and the comet nuclei were so small they couldn't see anything. So the question was, is there even a nucleus? What is this thing? They had no idea. And so anyway, it got to the point, so Carl Sagan, David Duncan Chair of Astronomy, as a young guy, calls all his buddies from geology, from Stephen Jay Gould, from anthropology, and all of these people from around all the different disciplines, and they say, we're going to bury Velikovsky. So they invite Velikovsky to basically a burial. That's 1974 American Association for the Advancement of Science. And they gang up on him. And the end result is that everybody agrees, all the scientists agree, that Velikovsky's wrong. This couldn't be possibly true. And he's a crazy old man, and he should just be... and so they developed this shadow that nobody in science can talk about Velikovsky. Well, a couple of years later, Velikovsky dies, an aged man, and called the crazy old man. And with it is installed in all of science this issue of Velikovsky's wrong, and then they installed the dirty snowball comet model, that the planets all formed at one time 4.5 billion years ago, and nothing has happened since, and certainly not a Velikovsky comet that came in through the solar system and became a planet. That couldn't happen. That the space, and Velikovsky talked about electricity in outer space. That couldn't happen, they said. That's impossible. Gravity is the sole force in the solar system. And then the Big Bang. Remember I talked about the Big Bang and the phony science of the Big Bang, and they're looking for dark matter and dark energy because none of the Big Bang hypotheses work out, so they need something. The boogeyman is dark science, or dark science. That's about it. Dark matter and dark energy, which they don't know what it is. They can't find it. They can't define any properties, but they know it's there. And they're spending all the money and research and telescope time searching for this thing that they don't even know what it is. Okay, so all of this gets its foundation, and evolution is mixed into this. So now you have evolution of man coming from the apes as part of it, and you have celestial evolution coming from the Big Bang, where you don't need a designer, you don't need God, you don't need the creator. It's all what I call atheist science. You don't need a God for any of this. There's no design. This just all happened at random. The universe just popped out, and all the protons and all of the structure that's on the far side of the universe exactly the same as it is here. No, there's no design there. All of this came out of that era, with Carl Sagan riding the white horse and holding the banner and charging into battle to defeat the foe. The only problem is they were wrong about everything they did, literally wrong. And they did it before we had real good space probe data. It wasn't until the late 70s and early 1980s that we had space probes at Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, eventually Venus. And one of the things, and here, okay, sorry for dragging us out so long, but I'm getting to the point here. One of the things that Velikovsky predicted is that since Venus was a new planet, it must be very hot. And of course, the standard scientists couldn't allow that. No, Venus is not hot. It's 4.5 billion years old. It has to be very cool. And they even predicted that there would be dinosaurs there. It has this carbon dioxide atmosphere, very dense, 95% carbon dioxide atmosphere, 1,000 times denser than Earth, but they didn't know that at the time until finally they landed there. And all they could see is this hazy cloud, upper atmosphere, carbon dioxide clouds on Venus. And so they said, no. And so they took the Arecibo telescope in Puerto Rico, which they had access to, and they trained it on Venus, and it came back and it showed that Venus was heavily cratered. And so Carl Sagan says, yes, speaks in Spanish. No, Carl Sagan says, yes, look at Venus is completely cratered, proving that it's like our moon and very ancient. And all of these craters on Venus prove this. Well, eventually, the Magellan spacecraft, which orbited Venus, proved that these were volcanic craters, recent, and that Venus' surface was oozing, and they would form volcanoes, and they would drop in the surface, and then it would be like a boiling pot of oatmeal, bubbling and exploding, and then with the air bubble that was left over, this mountain would sink in, and then it was this bubbling, churning surface. So Sagan was totally wrong about this admonition that Venus was an ancient planet because it had all these craters, like the moon. Well, the craters weren't craters from impacts. They were craters from active volcanoes. 4,500 big active volcanoes on Venus, the size of Mauna Loa, Mauna Kea in Hawaii, or the volcano at Yellowstone. Big volcanoes, 4,500 of them. And the way this was proven ultimately was with the Magellan orbiting spacecraft at Venus, where they went and they mapped the entire surface of Venus over the course of about a year with radar, penetrating radar through that thick CO2 atmosphere of Venus. And so they got done with the year mapping of the entire planet, and they said, well, the satellite's still going strong. Let's continue mapping. Let's do a second time. When they started mapping Venus the second time, it was totally changed. And they could see the mountains that were there were dropped down into a cavern, and the caverns that were there before are now mountains. So it's this bubbling, churning planetary surface with heat coming from within. So everything Sagan did was wrong. Everything he did in burying Velikovsky. And by the way, Albert Einstein, when he died, they went into his office and he had Velikovsky's book, Worlds in Collision, open on his desk. The reason he was interested, because he was working on the unification of the fields. Electricity, gravity, short and long range nuclear forces, etc. And so anyway, he was very interested in this idea of electricity in outer space, and Velikovsky's work held the key to it because the ancients had seen electrical activity in the solar system between the planets, Jupiter throwing lightning bolts across the sky to Mars, etc. And this comet, Venus, which was born of Jupiter. So getting back to a few things that Velikovsky had wrong. Velikovsky, in his assumption, said that, oh, Venus popped out of Jupiter. And that's what the ancients saw. Venus was not present in the solar system. All of a sudden they look up and there's Venus, the comet, coming out of Jupiter. It was not there before. But what really happened is Venus, this large planetary nucleus, came in and was captured. It was trapped by Jupiter's gravitational field and flung into the solar system. And that's when it became a big comet, very noticeable to the ancients. And then they started tracking this thing, and it's winding in closer and closer. It comes close to Mars. And what my work shows is that it's the tail drag that causes this spiraling inward of the orbit. So it comes by Mars, it winds its way in. They know that the people on Earth, watching this, these are people, watchers of the stars. These are ancient cultures that are very tuned to the stars. They didn't have Xbox and TV. That was their TV, the stars. And so they had all of this mapped, and you find the maps of Venus all over the world. You find them in Zimbabwe, you find them in the Mayans. They talk about this, and Quetzalcoatl is the plumed serpent god of the night sky. You talk, Moses talks about this. The big encounter with Moses was, remember the pillar of fire reaching up into the sky? That was the electrical connection from Venus. That was going on during the Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt. The 7 plagues were all, I've talked about this before, the 7 plagues were all a result of this passing comet. The movement of the Red Sea, when it sloshed one way due to the gravitational wave, the Israelites run across this passage, we know right where it is, on the Red Sea, get to the other side, and as the Pharaoh's armies come through, it comes washing back, kills them all, and those chariots are out there, right there in the Red Sea. You can see them. This is history, folks. This is real history. This is not, not the kind you're going to, unfortunately, not what you're going to be taught in school today or on the evening news. Okay, so let me get back and finish that in the next couple minutes here. The idea that all of a sudden the Russians land on Venus, and they report back that, no, Venus is not a nice warm planet. It's bubbling hot, it's volcanic, there's sulfuric acid raining out of the sky, and it's hot enough to melt lead. So Sagan and the boys got mud all over their face. They got to come back with something. So they come back and they say, oh, it's the greenhouse effect. There's all that carbon dioxide up there on Venus that's causing the greenhouse effect, and that's the high temperature cause of Venus. Well, it didn't take long, and scientists put a lot of holes through that, and they said, no, that isn't it. But in the meantime, they said, well, Earth has carbon dioxide. maybe it'll work here. This is where climate change got its roots, is in the movement of this greenhouse effect concept from Venus to planet Earth. And that's where it got traction. And it doesn't work on Venus. Let me give the numbers here. Venus has 95% CO2. Earth has 0.04%. So that's 24 times the percentage of CO2 in Venus's atmosphere, and now 2,400 times the amount of CO2 in Venus's atmosphere as in Earth's atmosphere. And Venus's atmosphere is 1,000 times denser. So multiply that number times 1,000, and Venus has 2,400,000 times the amount of CO2 in its atmosphere than Earth does. And the greenhouse effect, guess what, boys and girls, does not work on Venus. So how's it going to work on Earth? It's a sham. The whole thing is a sham. Bad science. Okay, so I'm going to just summarize a few things. There are two major events in man's history that are extremely formative. And these happened within probably the last 6,000 years. And one is the Noah's flood. We know for a fact, and the Earth bears this out all over the place. And in fact, there were a couple there was a flooding aspect of the Venus event. But prior to that, probably a few thousand years, we really don't know. But there's kind of an upper limit on that because the Old Testament gives us a genealogy. That's what the Old Testament is. Primarily a genealogy between Noah's flood, the Moses event, and Christ. That's what the Old Testament is. And if you look at it, there's not enough room in there for 10,000 years worth of history. So just from that alone, you can make some rough estimates that the Noah's flood happened probably around maybe 6,000 BC to maybe 3,000 BC, somewhere in that time frame. That's a pretty wide range. And that had a tremendous drastic effect on Earth. The ocean levels rose. Most of archaeology today is probably out on those continental shelves. Okay, well, that's another story I'll get into in a different show. But the second event, the second major event was and by the way, the Noah's flood was Earth passing through the tail of a large comet. Torrential rains, 40 days, 40 nights worldwide. Okay, next was the Venus event, where Venus, the large comet, came through the solar system, became the planet Venus, and because of the tail drag, and that's what caused, this is the part that science has been completely missing. This is a central core piece of my theoretical work, is to show that large comets attracting all of that material, the drag of the tail circularizes its orbit and causes an energy reduction. So that explains why Venus became a planet within Earth's orbit and how it happened. And the ancients talk about this. Like I say, there are calendars around the world. The Mayans talk about it because every time it came around, every time we had a conjunction with Venus, the comet, they went into hiding. And so this is a lot of my writings have to deal with this, the issue of science. And the standard science community solidified its work in the Cosmos series, where Sagan became a movie star, became very wealthy, very well known, and published the book. And the Cosmos series is the most watched video series in the history of the world. That's the level they're promoting this garbage science, so that it's universal. And there's a group of people at the very top who are promoting this who know better, the secret society. So this is a very complex topic. I'll be continuing next week, and we'll be delving into some of the more nefarious control aspects of this, and hopefully with some very well qualified guests.
This has been Master of Science with host James McCanny. Join us each week as James will delve into historical figures such as Nikola Tesla, Albert Einstein, and the great mathematicians as we explore the history of man, Earth, and our universe as you've never seen it before. Tuesdays, 7 p.m. Eastern, right here on the Bold Brave TV network, powered by B2.